The folder landed on Cleo Furst's desk at 2 in the afternoon. A Thursday in October that started like any other. By the time she finished reading the first page, her husband had called her a thief. By the time she set it back down, he had ended 23 years of marriage with one sentence. "The best day of my life," Grady Furst said, "will be the day you finally vanish out of it." Cleo looked at the folder. She looked at the man she had loved since she was 22 years old. She looked around the office. She had leased, furnished, and turned into the operational heart of a company that carried his name and had never once carried hers. Then she picked up her bag, picked up her laptop, and gave him exactly what he asked for. But to understand what really happened in that room, and what happened to both of them in the years that followed, you have to go back 23 years. You have to start in Flatbush, Brooklyn, with a young woman who had just earned a civil engineering degree and a future that was supposed to be fully her own. Cleo Obi grew up in Flatbush, Brooklyn, daughter of a seamstress, mother, and a father who drove a city bus for 31 years. They were not wealthy people, but they were people who believed. With the deep conviction of immigrant parents who had crossed an ocean for their children, that education was the one thing life could not take from you once you had earned it. Cleo earned it. She graduated from the New York Institute of Technology with a degree in civil engineering, finishing in the top 3 of her class. She could look at a structural problem and find the solution before most of her peers had finished reading the question. She was, by every measure that mattered in that industry, the beginning of something significant. Then she met Grady Furst at a mutual friend's gathering in Crown Heights on a Friday evening in late summer. He was 25, broad-shouldered, louder than most rooms he entered in the best possible way. A man who commanded job sites through sheer force of energy and presence. He had no degree, no formal training, no classroom knowledge of load calculations or structural analysis. What he had was raw ambition, a work ethic that started before sunrise, and a natural ability to lead a crew that no textbook had ever given him. In those early years, he was genuinely grateful for Cleo. That is important to say. He was not always the man he became. They married when Cleo was 22, a small ceremony in Crown Heights. Her mother wept through the whole thing. Grady's mother, Vera, sat in the front row, composed, watchful, making her careful assessments. 2 rows behind her sat Eula, Grady's younger sister. She smiled all day. She helped with the flowers. She hugged Cleo at the reception and said she was so glad they were family now. She looked like a proud sister, welcoming someone in. Nobody looked past that. Grady had a truck, a crew of 3, and the beginning of a company. He did not yet know how to run. He knew how to build. He understood materials, labor, and in his body from years of physical work. What he could not do was write a bid that a corporate client would take seriously. What he could not navigate was insurance renewals, subcontractor agreements, license deadlines, or the kind of professional relationships that produced repeat business over years and decades. Cleo could do all of that. Within a year of their wedding, she was running the entire back end of the company. She organized the paperwork, the contracts filed incorrectly, the invoices that had gone out late, the insurance certificates that had lapsed while nobody was watching. Then she started calling every contact she had built at NYT. Professors, classmates, people who had since moved into development firms, city contracting agencies, and commercial real estate groups across Brooklyn and Manhattan. She put together proposals so precise and so thoroughly documented that companies who had never heard the name started returning her calls. The first major contract came in year 3, a commercial renovation in Brownsville. Cleo spent 6 weeks building the bid and presented it herself because she understood what the room needed and she was the one who could deliver it. They won it. Grady celebrated with his crew that Friday evening and told the story of how he had landed the account. Cleo drove home, sat at the dining table, and spent the night mapping the project timeline so they could mobilize Monday morning. This became the shape of the next 23 years. He celebrated. She worked. He accepted handshakes at signing ceremonies. She made sure there was something worth signing. He stood at industry dinners and spoke about the company, his company, as though it had formed itself around him through some natural force, as though the clients, The contracts, the reputation had all simply arrived. He did not lose his wife in one day. He lost her every single year. He called her help instead of partner. Cleo told herself for a long time that this was what partnership looked like, that doing the work was its own reward, that knowing what she had built was enough, even if no one in any of those boardrooms ever understood who was truly behind it. That was the lie she kept telling herself, and she had told it so many times for so long that it had started to feel like the truth. Her salary went into an account in her name alone every single month. Not as strategy, as instinct. She was her mother's daughter, a woman who had watched her parents arrive in this country with nothing and understood early that you always keep something for yourself, not as a weapon, as a foundation. She would need it. Eula was always around. That was not unusual. She was family. She appeared at company, events, helped at dinners, called her brother on weekday evenings to check in. Warm with Cleo. Warm with everyone, in the way that certain people can sustain across years without the warmth ever. Quite feeling like it has roots. What Cleo noticed first was not Eula. It was Grady. Somewhere around year 19 of the marriage, he began to change, in small, hard-to-name ways. He started asking about the accounts in ways he had never asked before. Looking at documents he had always left to her. Coming home uncertain. Evenings with a tightness around his jaw that vanished when she asked about it and reappeared the following morning, unchanged. He said it was work stress, the weight of running a company at their scale. Cleo believed him because she wanted to believe him. She did not yet know that for months, while she was in meetings on site visits, managing the full operational structure of a company that ran on her decisions, someone had been sitting with her husband and filling the space of her absence with a different story. A story about the accounts, about patterns that looked suspicious, about a woman who had always known more than her husband, and what a person like that might do with that kind of knowledge. Eula did not invent the story all at once. She fed it slowly. One planted question, one gentle expression of concern from a sister who only wanted what was best for her brother. That was all it took, because the soil had been ready for years. The confrontation came the way confrontations do when a decision has already been made, loudly and with no space for the other person to speak. Grady stood across the desk from Cleo with his arms crossed and delivered what he had been told to believe, as though he had discovered it himself. Cleo read the documents inside the folder with the professional attention of a woman who had worked with financial records for 23 years. She recognized immediately what she was looking at. The records were fabricated. The pattern was too clean, too perfectly constructed to be real. Real financial activity leaves irregular traces, small variances, organic timing differences, the fingerprints of a living operation. These records had been built to tell a story, built with patience and access to the kind of help that money can quietly buy. She started to say this. Grady did not let her finish. He had been holding whatever was in that folder for longer than she knew, and the weight of it had become something that left no room for a counter-argument. He said what he believed in the full voice of a man who had already closed every door and had not come to open a single one. And in the middle of it all, with 23 years of marriage between them and the company she had built surrounding them on every wall, Grady first said it. The best day of my life will be the day you finally vanish out of it. Cleo closed the folder. She set it back on the desk with the same hands that had filed every successful bid this company had ever submitted. She looked at her husband of 23 years, not with tears, not with the raised voice of a woman defending herself to someone who had already decided. She looked at him with the full, clear recognition of a woman receiving information she had been half-knowing for a long time and had been refusing to face. She did not see a man who had been deceived. She saw a man who had been ready to be deceived. He had not asked her a single question. He had looked at a folder someone placed in front of him, and he had let it confirm what 20 years of comfortable pride had been preparing him to believe, that he had built this himself, that Cleo had been help, that whatever she contributed, it was not enough to earn her the benefit of a single doubt. She picked up her bag. She picked up her laptop. She took one last look at the office she had made from nothing. Then she walked out and did not look back. She made it to the parking garage on Atlantic Avenue before her hands started shaking. Not because she was afraid, because 23 years of a marriage had just answered her in one sentence. And the answer was not new. She could see now that it had been building for a very long time. But hearing it, out loud, from the mouth of the man she had given everything to, had a weight that her body needed a moment to absorb. She sat in the driver's seat. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel. Then she picked up her phone and called Kel. Some people watching this already know what it feels like to be the engine while someone else holds the steering wheel. If this story is landing somewhere real for you, subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments right now. Because what Cleo Furst built after she made that phone call, what she and her son built together from one rented room on Fulton Street, is something you need to stay until the very end to fully understand. Cal Furst was 20 years old, in his second year of construction management at City Tech, just a few blocks from the Atlantic Avenue garage where his mother now sat. He picked up on the second ring. Cleo told him what happened. Facts first, the way she always communicated. Kel listened without interrupting. When she finished, the line held 4 seconds of silence. Then he said, "Tell me where you are." "I'm coming now." He found her still in the parking garage. He got into the passenger seat, looked at his mother, and said something he had been carrying for years, waiting for the right moment without knowing it would arrive like this. "I was 12 years old," Kel said, "when I realized Dad didn't know how the company actually worked. I was 13 when I realized you were letting him believe he did." Cleo looked at her son. "You deserved better than that your whole career," he said. "So let's go build something that has your name on the front of it." Between them, they had Cleo's savings, 23 years of monthly deposits into an account that had always been hers alone. Not a fortune, but real and enough to begin. First in Kel Construction LLC was registered in the state of New York on a Monday morning. One rented room, 3rd floor, a building on Fulton Street in downtown Brooklyn. 2 desks, 2 laptops, a second-hand filing cabinet they carried up the stairs themselves. A window facing out over the rooftops of a borough Cleo had spent 23 years building, without her name appearing once on anything she had made. That was about to change. Grady wasted no time. Within days of Cleo's departure, a version of events began moving through Brooklyn's construction networks. Not announced, not sent by email, just dropped into conversations without fanfare. At site meetings, at industry events, in the exchanges between people who had all worked with the same firms over the same years. She had been stealing from the company. There were documents. The clients who had always returned Cleo's calls began to go silent. Not all at once. One at a time, the way trust erodes when a rumor finds the right soil. A call left unreturned. A meeting that did not get rescheduled. A developer she had worked alongside for 11 years who suddenly had another firm in mind. Cleo understood exactly what was happening. She did not have the energy to fight a story she could not see. She had a company to build. She made her list, every contact she had developed over 2 decades. Some were already gone, closed, off by whatever had been said. Others answered, cautiously, waiting to see what was true. She did not try to convince anyone. With words, she let the work convince them. The first year of Furst and Kel was the hardest year of Cleo's professional life. Bids lost to companies with longer track records. Potential clients who took meetings and then vanished. The invisible pressure of a damaged reputation. Felt in the way certain doors stopped, opening without anyone saying why. Then came the morning in March. Kel laid 2 invoices on her desk without a word. The office rent was due Friday. His construction management certification. Renewal, the credential that kept him legally qualified to work on licensed New York job sites, was due the same week. They had enough money for one, not both. Cleo sat with those 2 pieces of paper for a long time. She did not perform the decision for her son's benefit. She looked at the numbers the way she had always faced hard problems, directly, without flinching, until the right answer became clear. She paid for the certification. Then she called the building manager, a retired contractor named Ovell, who had been in this industry for 40 years, and explained the situation with the plain, unadorned honesty of a woman who had never needed to have that particular conversation before and was not going to dress it up now. Ovell listened. There was a pause. Then he said 2 weeks was fine. She would remember that man for a long time. The first real project came later that year, a commercial fit-out in Bed-Stuy for a restaurant group opening their third Brooklyn location. Cleo ran it the way she ran everything, total preparation, total presence, and the ground-level problem-solving. That comes from 23 years of knowing what goes wrong and positioning herself ahead of it before it does. They finished 3 weeks early. The client referred them to 2 developers before the project was even fully closed out. 1 conversation, 1 delivery, 2 referrals. That was how it had always worked for Cleo Furst, not through noise, but through excellence that arrived before she did. The billboard went up on a stretch of highway near the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway after their second year of winning. Work and building referrals. Her face, Kel's face, the company name. Clean, professional, impossible to miss. Her name, in public, on a borough she had spent 23 years building without it appearing once on anything she had made. Macon Diller drove past it on a Tuesday morning in November, on his way to a site review in Red Hook. He pulled over. Macon had spent 30 years in New York's construction and development industry. He ran Diller Crane Group with one standard. Excellence was the floor, and everything below it did not pass. He was not a man given to impulse. He pulled over because he recognized the face on that board. He remembered 2 projects, not the largest Diller Crane had overseen, but the 2 delivered without a single complication from start to finish. No request to revisit the timeline. No budget surprises. No back-end excuses. Both had been managed by a woman who showed up to every meeting with documentation that answered his questions before he asked them, who spoke to his engineers as a full equal, who solved field problems with the speed of someone who had already seen every version of every problem there was. He had always assumed she owned the company. He had never asked. The work had spoken loudly enough that the question had not felt necessary. Now, sitting on the side of the road with her face above the BQE, an anger moved through him, the kind belonging to a man who has just understood what he is looking at and does not find it acceptable. He called the number on the billboard. Cleo answered on the second ring. When she finished telling him everything, not with grief, not with self-pity, but with the factual precision of a woman who has had time to fully understand the shape of what was done to her. Macon was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I want to tell you something. Every meeting I ever had with your husband's company, I dealt with you entirely. Every proposal, every project review, every site conversation. I told my team afterward that the operator running that company was one of the sharpest I had encountered in this industry in years. He paused. I always believed you owned it. I am sorry. That turned out to be the wrong assumption. Cleo said, I was never the owner, but the work was always mine. Macon said, yes. I understand that now, all of it. He told her about the project, the largest bid Diller Crane had ever opened, a multi-phase infrastructure and commercial development in Bushwick. Fully competitive, formally structured. But he wanted Furst and Kel in that room. Cleo told him they would be there. Word moved through Brooklyn's construction industry the way it always has, faster than anyone intends, and through channels nobody fully controls. When the Diller Crane bid became public and the invited companies were named, Grady heard Cleo's name attached to it within 48 hours. What he did next completed his own destruction in a way he could not undo, could not explain away, and could not survive professionally. He contacted Diller Crane and submitted a package, the same folder, the same documents he had been carrying since October, the ones whose origins he had never once thought to question, along with a handwritten letter stating that the woman bidding on their project had stolen from her previous employer and could not be trusted with a contract of any scale. Diller Crane's compliance team reviewed the materials. By the end of the 3rd day, they did not just know the documents were false. They knew Grady Furst had submitted fabricated material into an active bid process, and that was the kind of act that does not go unaddressed. They sent him a formal written notice, Cease and desist. Do not contact the company or its employees again regarding the selection. Do not submit further materials about any candidate. Failure to comply would result in legal action for deliberate commercial interference and defamation. Grady received that letter on a Thursday morning and read it for times. Then he drove to Eula's apartment in Flatbush. He put the letter on her kitchen table. He laid the folder beside it. He sat across from his sister in the kitchen where their mother had fed them as children and asked her, for the very first time, the question he should have asked before he ever walked into that office on Atlantic Avenue. Where did these come from? Eula looked at the letter. She looked at the folder. She looked at her brother's face. She was tired, the bone-deep tired of a person who has been holding a lie that grew far heavier than it was ever worth. The company was gone. The position was gone. Everything she had maneuvered toward had turned out to be held together not by Grady's name, his work ethic, or any force she could inherit, but by the irreplaceable competence of the woman she had removed from it. She had taken the beam out of the house to own the house, and then she had watched the house fall in on itself. She told him everything. How long she had been planning it. The person she had paid to construct the fabricated financial records. Someone who knew how to build a paper trail that looked convincing to an untrained eye. The months of patient positioning, being in Grady's ear, feeding the doubt question by question, pressing on the crack in his pride until it opened wide enough to swallow whatever she placed inside it. What she had wanted from the beginning, the company, the standing, the position she had watched Cleo hold for 23 years. You think I wanted too much? Eula said. No, I wanted what she had been standing in front of for 23 years. She said it without apology, without a trace of remorse, with the flat, exhausted clarity of a woman making a final accounting of something that had cost more than it ever returned. Grady sat in his sister's apartment and understood, completely, without the protection of anyone else's version of events, what he had done. He had been given something extraordinary. A woman of rare intelligence and complete commitment who had chosen to build her abilities around the company he started. He had spent 20 years, slowly rewriting the story of that company until she was secondary in it. When the lie arrived dressed as evidence, he accepted it, without a single question, because it confirmed what 2 decades of pride had long been preparing him to want to hear. He had not lost his wife in one day. He had lost her every year. He called her help instead of partner. The folder in October had only been the final accounting of a debt he had been building since the beginning. He returned to what remained of Grady Furst construction, the accounts, the few surviving contracts, the staff who had not yet finished leaving. He sat in the office Cleo had built and saw it clearly, perhaps for the first time, not as something he had created, but as something he had inherited from a woman whose name was never on the door. The company closed within months. The money drained through contractor penalties, project disputes, and the damage of 18 months of mismanagement. The name Grady Furst Construction, which Cleo had made worth something in this borough, one delivered project at a time, now appeared in the industry alongside failed deadlines, suspended contracts, and a cease and desist from one of Brooklyn's most respected development firms. He was back to a truck, an empty roster, 48 years old. He had built himself exactly there. Cleo walked into the Dillard Crane bid presentation on a Wednesday morning in January. Kel beside her, 3 months of preparation behind them. 7 other companies were in that room. Some were larger. Some had longer track records. The process was formal and fully competitive. Cleo presented last. She was not thinking about Grady when she stood at the front of that room. She was thinking about the project, the phases, the Bushwick site challenges that other proposals had treated as standard, and that she had spent 3 months identifying as requiring solutions built from scratch. She knew this work the way she knew all her work, from the ground up, with no gaps and no uncertainty. She presented for 44 minutes. The panel questioned her for another hour. When it ended, she and Kel gathered their materials and walked out into the January cold. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and simply breathed. Kel looked at her. That was the best presentation in that room. Yes, she said, not with arrogance, but with the certainty of a woman who knows exactly what she put on a table. Dillard Crane called 4 days later. Furst and Kell Construction had been awarded the Bushwick project. The project ran for 22 months. Furst and Kell delivered it in 19. Dillard Crane said publicly afterward that it was the most precisely executed multi-phase project they had overseen in the New York market in over a decade. Macon Dillard was quoted by name. He described, in the language of a man who does not offer praise unless it is fully earned, what it looked like to watch someone operate at the highest level of their profession. The phone at Furst and Kell rang differently after that. Developers, city agencies, commercial groups with large portfolios, and a need for a contractor they could trust across all of them. Furst and Kell grew the way real things grow, not through a single explosive moment, but through the compounding of excellence delivered consistently, year after year, until their name in. Brooklyn's construction industry was not just established, it was the standard other firms were measured against. Cleo watched her son grow inside the company with the pride of a mother watching someone become who they were always meant to be, not shaped by his father's limitations, but built on everything she had spent a lifetime earning. 2 years after the Bushwick project closed, Grady Furst was driving through Flatbush on a Tuesday morning when he slowed at an intersection and looked up. A new development was rising on the corner, 18 stories high, a construction crane turning above the frame, and along the full length of the site hoarding on the block, in letters visible from the center of the street. Furst and Kell Construction. Her name, in Brooklyn, on a building she was raising above the same skyline she had spent her whole career building, without credit, without recognition, without her name on a single thing. Until now. He sat at that intersection until the light changed twice. Then he drove away. He tried to reach her once. A letter, delivered to the Fulton Street office about 18 months after the Dillard Crane project was awarded. He wrote about regret, about what Eula had confessed and what it had done, to him to truly understand it, about going back to zero, knowing without any remaining doubt that he had built himself thereby. His own choices. He wrote that he had no right to ask for anything he was not asking. He simply needed her to know that he understood what he had thrown away, not in one moment, but across 23 years of taking for granted the person who made everything possible. Cleo read the letter at her desk. She set it down. She looked out the window at the Brooklyn skyline, the same rooftop she had been contributing to for 30 years, the same borough she had poured herself into without a name on any of it. She thought about the woman who had walked into a rented office at 23 years old with a degree she had earned and a belief in what two people could build together. She thought about everything that woman had given. She thought about what had been given back. She put the letter in the drawer and closed it. She did not write back. Not out of bitterness. Bitterness belonged to people still fighting a war, and Cleo's war was finished. She had won it. Completely, and winning completely meant she no longer had to carry anything from it. Not grief, not resentment, and not the weight of a man whose regret, however genuine, however late, was his alone to hold for the rest of his life. She was 48 years old. She had a son who stood beside her every morning. She had a company carrying her name on buildings across Brooklyn. She had the career she had spent 23 years quietly building, finally operating under the only name it had ever deserved to carry. Grady Furst had told her to vanish, and she had. She had vanished from the background of someone else's story and walked directly into the center of her own. Never confuse someone's silence for absence. Sometimes the quiet person in the room is the only reason the whole room is still standing. Share this with someone who has been holding everything up in silence. Drop the continent you are watching from in the comments. We want to know where you are watching from. Subscribe for more stories that stay with you. We will see you in the next one.